Transport is now the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas pollution in Britain for the first time since records began. New figures reveal a 2% increase in emissions outputs in 2016 pushed transport ahead of the energy supply sector. For the first time after the latter managed to trim emissions by 17% year-on-year, largely by reducing its usage of coal-fired power stations. Transport is now at risk of extending its position at the top of the table of most polluting sectors following the government's recent crackdown on low CO2-emitting diesel cars. The latest figures have been released by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It said total greenhouse gas emissions fell by 5% in Britain in 2016. With energy supply, business and sectors categorized as other all reducing the amount of pollution they produce. However, many sectors posted increases. This includes transport, which is now responsible for more than a quarter of Britain's greenhouse gas outputs. It's the first time since records began 26 years ago that cars, buses, vans and trains have produced more environment-damaging emissions than any other sector. Since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions have fallen 41% in the UK, while carbon dioxide, the biggest contributor, is down 36%. BIS added, energy supplies have reduced their total outputs by 57% in that time. But the transport sector hasn't had the same level of improvement, lowering greenhouse gas emissions by just 2% between 1990 and 2016. Leading to recent plans to cull the sale of diesel and petrol-powered cars in the near future, the government already announced ambitions to end sales of new vehicles powered solely by combustion engines in 2040 as part of efforts to tackle climate change and air pollution. The Committee on Climate Change, which advises the government on meeting its long-term legally binding climate targets, said last month that 3 in 5 new cars sold in 2030 need to be electric in order for the country to hit its low emissions targets, including cutting transport emissions by 44%. Friends of the Earth climate campaigner Simon Bullock said, despite this welcome fall in climate-wrecking pollution, the transport sector is still failing to play its part in slashing emissions. Transport Secretary Chris Grayling must play catch-up fast. His department can't continue to crawl along in this slow lane when it comes to tackling climate change. And if we want to play our part in international efforts to prevent global warming, we must do even more. Raising our ambition to match the Paris Agreement and taking immediate measures such as allowing communities to build onshore wind and solar and ensuring all new homes are zero carbon, a government spokeswoman responded to report, saying, today's statistics emphasize the UK's leadership in tackling climate change. Since 1990, we have cut emissions by more than 40% while growing our economy by over two-thirds, the best performance of any G7 nation. We want to build on this success, which is why clean growth is at the heart of our ambitious industrial strategy. Ensuring the UK is well placed to take advantage of the economic opportunities presented by the switch to a low-carbon economy. The government has come down hard on diesel in recent months as part of plans to reduce harmful emissions being pumped into the nation's air. This culminated in the Chancellor's budget decision to increase first-year tax for anyone who buys a new diesel car from April next year. But the decision to dissuade drivers from buying the fuel type has seen CO2 emissions for new vehicles rise for the first time in 14 years in 2017. Department for Transport figures show that the average new car sold in 2017 produces more CO2 than one sold in 2016, reversing a continuous decline in greenhouse gas emissions on this measure since figures were originally published in 2003. Official statistics for the first 10 months of 2017 show that the average new car sold this year produces 121.1 grams of CO2 per kilometer. The average CO2 output of new vehicles sold in 2016 was 120.3 grams per kilometer. Experts warn that the higher number of petrol cars hitting the road compared to diesel threatens to derail the government's ambitious climate change targets. Car manufacturers are already under pressure to meet an EU target of cutting average CO2 emissions across the ranges to 95 grams per kilometre by 2021. The International Council on Clean Transportation, a research group that has led the campaign against harmful diesel emissions, said advanced petrol engines as well as electric and hybrid technology will cut CO2 emissions quicker than the latest diesels could. Quite a lot of petrol vehicles do not use the latest technologies available and still have higher CO2 emissions than comparable diesel cars, said Peter Mock, Managing Director of ICCT Europe. However, the unfortunately often repeated statement that diesel cars are necessary to decrease CO2 emissions is simply wrong. Instead, hybridizing petrol vehicles and transitioning to electric vehicles today makes more sense for vehicle manufacturers. Monk also blamed the increased sales of SUVs, which are generally less fuel efficient than a hatchback alternative, for the spike in average CO2 outputs. However, the recent demonization of diesel has sparked concerns that these objectives won't be met if manufacturers can't even shift low-emissions diesel cars that comply with the existing Euro 6 standards. At the end of last year, Tamsin Isaacson, director at the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, said if industry is to meet challenging CO2 targets, getting more of the latest low-emission diesels onto our roads is crucial, as they can emit 20% less CO2 than the equivalent petrol models. She blamed confusion around government air quality plans and taxation for plummeting diesel sales. She added, if new diesel car registrations continue on this negative trend, UK average new car CO2 levels could indeed rise this year. Med Freeman, managing consultant at car valuation firm Gap HPI, added, hitting the 2021 environmental targets for CO2 reduction would be a significant challenge without the likely decline in diesel. Therefore, it is imperative that diesels continue to command a substantial share of the new car marketplace. If consumers, with no option of transitioning to hybrid or EVs, switch to petrol, the environmental impact is clear. Their CO2 emissions would likely rise between 3% and 23% according to model.
Where the freaks at?